Pennhurst, where voices never fall silent. There are places that should never be forgotten, places that have left behind more than just ruins. And then there is Pennhurst, a place where the voices are not just echoes of the past.
They have called me. They said my name, but the cells were empty. They were all empty.
Are you ready to hear their story? Well, the House of Lost Souls, the forgotten psychiatric hospital of Pennhurst. A dark tale based on real events. Pennhurst State School and Hospital, opened in Pennsylvania in 1908, was supposed to be a refuge, a sanatorium for the mentally and physically impaired. But instead, it became a house of horrors for the living dead. The patients came, but they never left. Even today, those who walk through the deserted corridors whisper of unexplained shadows, voices in the wind, and the echo of screams that no one should hear. Some say that the souls of the lost never really disappeared. Maybe you can hear them if you listen carefully. Pennhurst was founded at a time when mental illness was synonymous with undesirable. Hospitals were overcrowded and towns wanted to get rid of their problem cases. So a huge sanatorium was built, far away from the city, hidden behind dense forests. At first, only a few patients came, but soon Pennhurst was overcrowded. Men, women, and even children were locked in dark rooms with little more than a thin blanket and a rusty bed frame. They lived, but it wasn't a life. Abuse was part of everyday life. The nurses beat their patients, left them to lie in their own excrement. According to reports, some were locked in small cells without daylight for weeks, months, some for years. And then something strange began. The patients fell silent. In 1921, the doctors reported a strange incident. Several patients stopped speaking. They just sat there with empty eyes, moving their lips, but no sound came out of their mouths. At first, the doctors thought it was shock or trauma, but the number increased. By the winter of 1922, there were over 50 patients. And then the whispering began. The night nurses heard them first, quiet voices coming from the dark rooms. But when they looked, they only found silent patients with open, staring eyes. The patients no longer spoke, but something was speaking through them. One man did not believe in ghosts. One man believed in science. Dr. Charles Eddington, head physician at Pennhurst, thought it was all hysteria. He began to carry out tests on the silenced patients. Electric shocks, hypnosis, medication. But nothing helped. One night, he left one of the patients alone in a darkened room with a security guard and a sound recorder. The recording began at 2:33 a.m. At 2:40 a.m., the guard heard footsteps, but the patient sat still. At 2:41, the patient began to mumble.
Does anyone hear me? Does anyone hear me?
At 2:42, the guard heard a second whisper, but the patient had not moved his mouth. At 2:43, the guard screamed. The recording ended abruptly. The next morning, he was found in a state of shock, his eyes wide open, his mouth in a distorted, inhuman grin. He never spoke another word. A creature, something in the shadows. The patient in cell 34 was one of the last to speak. He kept scratching a word into the walls of his cell. Silent. He wrote it 1,000 times. Then he too fell silent. In 1968, an investigative journalist revealed what really happened behind the walls of Pennhurst. His television report shook an entire nation. The images he showed were not those of a hospital. They were those of a nightmare. The camera flickered across dark, cold rooms where people were kept like animals. Some patients crouched naked on the floor of their cells, the walls scratched with their bare hands. Others lay in their beds, their bodies emaciated, their eyes empty, as if they had long forgotten that they were once human. Then there were the chambers, places where no one went voluntarily. The forgotten were locked away there, You saw rusty cribs, dirty mattresses on the floor. You saw patients lying in their own excrement, their skin chafed by the shackles that bound them to the beds. And you could hear the voices, not the screams. They had already stopped. But something else could be heard from the empty, dark rooms. A quiet murmur, a whisper that crept through the corridors, as if it was following those who wanted to hear it. When the journalist spoke into the camera, his voice shaken, his voice failed him for a moment. Then he whispered something that couldn't even be heard clearly on the tape. He later said it felt as if someone had breathed directly into his ear. Pennhurst was finally closed in 1977, but the people who lived there were never locked up. The reports never stopped. Ghost hunters, researchers, even skeptics came and went, but not all remained untouched. Footsteps in empty corridors, as if someone was there, or many. Whispers in dark rooms, even when no one was speaking. Figures in the shadows that came when the light flickered and disappeared again as soon as you blinked. And some who came never returned the same. A man who spent a night alone in the ruins in 1994 wrote just one sentence on a piece of paper the next day. He saw me. He then left his house and was never found again. To this day, Pennhurst is considered one of the most haunted places in America. Visitors report an eerie presence, a force that watches people. EVP recordings from the ruins revealed disturbing voices. "Stop it. Let me go. I'm here." A photographer walking through the site in 1998 took one last photo in a dark room. When he developed it, a figure could be seen in it. Long, shadowy, with a broad, inhuman smile. He never spoke about the picture again. Today, Pennhurst is abandoned. The buildings are crumbling. The grounds are closed. But if you approach the fence and put your ear to the rusty bars, then you can hear it, the whispering. And if you're unlucky enough to hear your name, then you should never answer, because the lost souls of Pennhurst are still searching for new voices. Maybe yours will be the next.